Live everywhere.
Daily Co's Radio on netrootsradio.com presents
David Waldman. Kagro in the Morning Show. Now, here's David Waldman.
Hey, good morning, everybody. How you doing? It is Thursday, June 20th, 2019. Time for yet another show. Good news. There's another interpretation in just now on how to pronounce Quinta Jurecic Jurecic and her name. Well, this one actually pointing to is it a first-person source? It's the Rational Security podcast. Is that right, that you're listening to? Okay. So thanks very much to Ad Karatic, who has advised us that at least on this podcast, and I don't even know, is that her podcast? I think so, maybe, or maybe she's been on it enough times, or it's hosted by people with whom she frequently writes. I can at least see Benjamin Wittes there, so they may have some idea. And I think that was the original pronunciation we were going with. Quinta. Quinta's not hard. Jurecic is what it says here. And then I was worried that sounded too much like Jurassic, so that couldn't possibly be it. It probably does have the Slavic roots, and maybe over in Eastern Europe, people might be tempted to then say Jurecic, but maybe not happening here in the United States because we don't understand any foreign languages, and people don't remember, or sometimes people remember how their ethnic surnames are supposed to be pronounced, but they know that they're in America and nobody else is going to do that, so they just try and make it easier for everybody else and anglicize it. It happens. Basically, I guess what this means is that there's no way of knowing, because, I don't know, unless I listen to Rational Security and she's on and she says it's this. Who knows for sure, but we'll go with that. Quinta Jurecic. It is a little too close to Jurassic for comfort for me. Anyway, okay, well, today is the day. I am reliably informed by Bill in Portland, Maine, that I, Kagro X, will launch the radio resurgence of 24-hour disco, or at least the question is posed whether that will be the case. No, it won't be. I would consider doing it, but it would probably get me in copyright trouble. And maybe we could raise funds to pay for an ASCAP license. Is that the right one? And then we could pay one of the music services and pay royalties that way and play disco. Well, we couldn't do 24 hours, but you'd be on your own for 22 of those hours. However, I guess if I build up enough podcasts in the library, I suppose you could make it through the day. But things would eventually get a little repetitive, let's say. Okay, what's happening this morning? Plenty to catch up on. Of course, the world continued to debate whether or not the concentration camps are concentration camps, with people lining up on all sorts of sides. Chuck Todd, of course, took to the air to tut-tut because Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez was the person who said that the concentration camps were concentration camps, and that can't stand. It doesn't matter. That was very interesting, I thought. Interesting angle. Everybody actually took it at face value that Chuck Todd was intervening over the meta question of language. But I think it's much more likely that Chuck Todd intervened because Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez was the one who said it. But I can't prove that, and that's not what he says the intention is. However, I find him guilty. So that's the end of that. We don't have to worry about that any further. Just also rolling by the way, and it says here, just in. The Hill could never lie to us. This just in. Watchdog claims, I don't know who the watchdog is, that Ivanka Trump violated the Hatch Act after federal office called for Conway's firing. So I don't know exactly what that means. Is it the watchdog, the federal agency, or is it a watchdog group outside? Let's see. I'm sure it's Crew. Yep, it is. Well, there you go. A watchdog group filed a complaint with the Office of Special Counsel on Thursday claiming Ivanka Trump, you know who she is, violated the Hatch Act, which bars federal employees from engaging in elections in their official capacity. What did they say she did in particular? They cited a tweet from Ivanka Trump 2 days before the president's campaign launch. That would have been the Orlando, Florida rally from yesterday, the day before. I've lost track. Doesn't matter. citing that tweet from 2 days before, featured the MAGA campaign slogan and stating the best is yet to come. She shouldn't be tweeting the campaign slogan from her official account if that's going to have some sort of government weight behind it. So we'll see. I don't know if it'll matter because LOL YOLO nothing does. But, okay, well, that's out there too. I just thought I would fill you in on that. And that means now I have to give you that link later on in the roundup of the day's stories. But let's see, plenty more happening right away on the, here's Greg, okay. Let's just get right to Greg's roundup then. That'll be an easy enough thing as I'm gasping for air, having run to the microphone at 9 on the dot. But
you made it.
Yeah, I mean, there is that. I could still be out there arranging items before the plumber comes later on. But I did manage, I think, to get them to come after 11. So we should be in good shape there. Good morning, Greg. How are you?
Good morning. I'm just fine. So I feel like I was listening to the show yesterday after the show, when you finally get it up and posted around 11:30, 12 o'clock every day.
Yeah, I was a little late.
So I had a chance to listen to it. And sometimes I like to listen to myself just to see what I got wrong and how badly I mangled names. And but I had the opportunity to listen to your master class on how the House works, which was the second part of the show. And I was we were talking yesterday about how the House Rules Committee can basically write whatever rules they want because the rule
and they do every
the Rules Committee really sets the pace as to what's going to be acceptable and whether the various ways the House can try to address this, usually fruitlessly, if leadership wants it to be a certain way. That's what you covered, but I was happy toward the end of that segment. That was the second hour.
Oh, yes?
that you tied it back to impeachment. Because that was really the key thing.
Yeah.
All right. So if leadership wants a certain thing, they set it up so that that's how that thing happens.
Yes.
And you talked about the fact, and I'm not talking about this in terms of Nancy Pelosi's going to decide whether or not we do impeachment and she rules and that's the way it works. That's not where I'm going with this. It's the idea that a lot of times that you explain very well why leadership doesn't necessarily want some of these things to come to a vote because it puts their particular members in a spot that leadership is trying to protect them from.
Yes.
Yes, you can get your way by voting in the majority, but that means an individual might have to vote one way or the other for leadership in order to get such and such passed. And then the opponents use that as, look what you voted for. I'm taking this back to the district and I'm running on it against you.
Yeah.
And that's what Pelosi's trying to protect her people from. I'm not talking about the wisdom of whether or not that's the proper decision. I'm talking about the fact that that's what's going on. And I think that in the example of trying to use it as what happens if you want to rescind the Hyde Amendment, you get to the very heart of what happens if you're trying to deal with impeachment.
That is true. And it happens on a lot of issues. As a matter of fact, I had tucked something away for discussion later. I'll just preview it. But the House did pass one of the appropriations bills last night, the one that they were attempting to attach the Hyde Amendment to. And it was noted late at night that there was something significant stuck into the bill, just 11 lines in this, probably hundreds of pages of appropriations in this bill, but a 11-line passage that repeals, at least if it were to pass the Senate and make it into law, repeals the 2001 authorization for the use of military force with an eye on Iran. So actually a great democratic strategic idea, and one that would have perhaps difficulty or at least engender a lot of controversy if it were to stand alone. So they put it into the Appropriations Bill. But everyone remembers what you're not supposed to put now in an appropriations bill. You're not supposed to put authorizing language or deauthorizing language, legislative language. They were legislating in an appropriations bill, which is why they told you. Rules. Yeah, that's exactly right. And guess what? The House Rules Committee passed a rule that said all points of order against the bill are waived. So what they did yesterday is exactly what they said they couldn't do for Hyde, but did do for the AUMF repeal, which I thought that's great. Also wish she could have done it for Hyde. But remember that the whole thing balances on the leadership being in a position to tell members that they can go back to their districts and tell this group of people couldn't do it, wanted to, would have loved to, but against the rules. Tell that group of people, well, you don't have to tell them anything about the rules. You just tell them, we did what you wanted. The Senate killed it. Trump vetoed it, whatever it is, but we did what you wanted. If the two groups get together, there's going to be some awkward moments. But you know what? There's a lot of people who belong to both groups and will scratch their heads as they come out and say, I wonder why they... Well, most people wouldn't, but a few people will come out and say, that is odd that they told me they couldn't do this, but they did do that. That is weird. And that's the part they don't want you to figure out.
Say to themselves, we gave the Democrats the majority in the House so that we could pass good legislation and consider impeaching Trump, and it's a check against him passing all of the things that he would want to do, which would be vile, which would be expanding concentration camps. I feel like we covered that adequately yesterday, and that that's why we did it. And of course, leadership in the House would say, no, you actually gave us the majority so that we could do these manipulation things, because that's actually how it works here.
Yeah, I mean, and eventually, by the way...
And that's not a bad thing. And let me explain to you, as David Waldman did yesterday, why it's not a bad thing. You have to do this in order to make it function, and at the same time, you also have to protect your members so they come back in 2 years.
Yeah, I mean, if somebody comes out of both of those meetings and says, I was at one and I was at the other, and I got a question for you, how come you could do it for this and not for that? The answer is, well... You can't always get what you want.
Right. And that's in fact true.
Yeah.
But you always get what you need. So what do we need? We need more of those 15, 18, 20 moderates in Trump-leaning districts to come out for impeachment. And slowly but surely we're getting them.
Yes.
We got Katie Porter the other day. Harley Ruda says he's going to do it by the end of the month, which is like next week. 10 days or so.
Oh, right, yeah.
This morning... I see a piece from the Chicago Sun-Times I just sent you. Democratic Representative Sean Casten, who flipped a competitive suburban Chicago congressional district in 2018, told the Chicago Sun-Times he backs launching an impeachment inquiry against Trump. Trump is just doing these things. And, you may think, and Chuck Todd may think that tut-tut, this whole concentration camp discussion reflects badly on Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Actually, it reflects badly on the administration, bud.
Yes.
And those people who are worrying about the language of what you call it, rather than what they are and what's going on there, are completely missing the boat. And as people see Trump doubling down on this sort of thing, threatening without adequate resources to deport 11 million people because it sounds good,
it's getting close
all
to
that
time.
sort of stuff. You get convinced, this is not a good president. And by the way, we're about to enter into this war with Iran step by step, talking about the AUMF. And turns out we don't have a Secretary of Defense. We don't have an acting Secretary of Defense who's anything other than a formerly acting Secretary of Defense. We don't have a Secretary of the Air Force. We have a bunch of positions in the Pentagon that aren't filled. What are we doing?
I don't know. We're winging it.
Everybody has a different reason for thinking, okay, that's the last straw. Your last straw and my last straw was like 2 years ago.
Part of the discussion yesterday, right? You can never really tell exactly what brings some conglomerate of 218 members of the House together.
The whole thing about hurting cats is just so true. And I love cats.
Yes, right. So don't hurt
cats. Especially adorable little kittens. But, the point is that it's not easy. Pelosi happens to have those skills. This is not you have to do everything she says and she's always right. But clearly this is the background, and I think it's always helpful to understand those backgrounds before you go ahead and decide, where you stand is it depends upon where you sit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So we have that. So we have a creep. I like to call it a tide, made it get metaphorical, poetic. But you have a creep of like a weed that sort of inculcates itself and spreads little by little in the lawn, and now you can't get it out. And so impeachment is spreading.
Yes.
And you can't stop it. You can't pull it out by its roots because the roots are Trump.
Yeah. In the end, when and if Nancy Pelosi says, This was all part of my plan.
Well, she's allowed to do
okay,
that. I mean,
that's cool.
It's
I'm with you. Yeah, right. We'll a lot of us will accept that.
We'll roll our eyes.
Yeah. Others will say, this is great. See, I told you. Oh, okay, whatever. Look, the point is I needed 218 yeses, and you got me there. One of them pretended that they weren't trying to get there. One of them pretended that they were trying to get there, hoping that they never would. Okay, but did you say yes? All right, thank you.
Yeah.
No further questions.
Right. The idea of what you cover and how you cover, of course, is not necessarily up to us, and it's not necessarily up to the House. They can't dictate the way Trump can with the White House megaphone as to, okay, let's do this story or that story. I'm having a discussion this morning with Mark Murray, partly based on what's happening in the Democratic primary side. Of course, they're pointing out this has been a bad 2 days for Joe Biden, but in a larger context. Okay, and the larger context is this. Democrats find there's the headline, Democratic candidates find their outrage scales different from Trump's. Okay. The last 2 days have demonstrated one of the Democratic Party's biggest challenges against Trump, especially over the next year. Their presidential field is going to rough each other up over issues that cut to the heart of the debate over the party's future. For example, Joe Biden saying, Eastland, Thurman, I could work with those guys, that sort of thing. But that would barely register a blip on the daily Trump outrage scale.
True.
And they use the example of, Trump refuses to apologize to the Central Park Five, doubles down on they were guilty.
Yes.
And Biden has to apologize or otherwise make amends or hope it doesn't matter or hope it doesn't, however you want to frame it, regarding remarks that have to do with history even older than the Central Park Five.
Yeah.
Right? The next day, the Democratic presidential field piled on frontrunner Joe Biden for recalling civility and working with segregationist Democratic Senators Eastland and Talmadge from the 70s, even if he disagreed with them on the issues. Now, staff reports start leaking. We told him not to. We told Uncle Joe not to go there. He went there anyway.
He's his own man. Let Biden be Biden.
Let Biden be Biden, right? Cory Booker calls for Biden to apologize, bit of a pile-on. And, of course, Biden says, I'm not going to apologize.
Yeah, he said, you should apologize. That was funny.
First Reed is just making this point. He says, don't get us wrong. We've said before that one of Biden's biggest weaknesses in the 2020 Democratic race is how his nearly 50-year career in Washington makes him seem out of touch with today's Democratic Party on race, abortion, on, quote, civility, end quote. And it also showed how the rest of the Democratic field isn't going to give him the benefit of the doubt on any of these issues. And we got a debate coming up next week. Well, and that's what happens when you're the front runner. And we'll see how he handles it. So this is, for people who don't like Biden, is an example of, see, this is what we're talking about. And people who are stepping back and looking at his position in the polls, which remains very strong, is saying, okay, well, let's see what happens. Harry Enton put together a chart that I put in there. It's a very short list of stuff that I gave you because a lot of this is worth talking about for a while. But Harry Enton put together a list of was the national poll leader in late June, which is where we are now, also leading in other indicators. There's the national, there's Iowa, there's New Hampshire, there's endorsements.
Oh, I see. Yes, okay.
Right? And Biden, is ahead in all of those things. And the other people who are ahead in all of those things, Bush, Dole, Gore, the other Bush, Romney, Clinton, Reagan, Mondale, they all won.
Okay.
And the people who had, like in 2008, Hillary Clinton, didn't have a lead in Iowa and didn't lead in all of the indicators. Wound up losing.
Okay.
Just making the point that there's a whole lot of other things besides just what the latest poll in South Carolina shows that suggests that Biden has considerable strength within the party.
Yes. All right.
And it may not be your segment. It may not be your faction. You may look at it and say, obviously, he's doomed, the way and Ed Muskie was. Of course, had stuff done to him in order to make him in that situation. Even though at the time he seemed to have a fairly commanding lead as being the front runner. But things happen, whether it was deliberate or whether it was orchestrated or whether it was yourself things happen sometimes. And so front runners don't always wind up winning in the end. But the ones who have strength demonstrated throughout the Democratic Party by looking at all the different aspects, the endorsements, the money, all that sort of stuff, actually tend to do fairly well. I'm just making that point because the people who think that Biden will self-destruct because of various and sundry pick your reason are always waiting for it to happen as soon. It's the same thing with Trump. Oh, Trump is going to self-destruct because he just said this thing. We now know that that's not true. And we don't do that anymore. Right. We used to do that in the beginning of Trump's term. Look what he did now. He said this about McCain. He said, yada.
Even before he was elected, yeah.
A lot of that's true for Biden, too.
I guess
it's not just going to go away just because you don't like him. That's not how it works.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's a good point. I mean, if Trump taught you anything, it's that there are some circumstances under which some people just seem to be bulletproof. But we've seen that before. We've had Teflon presidents
and I'm not for a moment suggesting Biden's bulletproof or that he should be.
No.
And, he's going to have to explain himself. And you know what? The luck of the draw has it, for example, that he'll be on the same stage as Kamala Harris, who I don't think is going to just ignore this.
Right. Okay.
And she's pretty good at cross-examining people. Not that you get to directly look at this and do that, because the moderator gives you 30 seconds and all that. So the format isn't always the best way to do this. So I'm just saying, Biden is set up for a fall, but that doesn't mean that fall is going to happen. And there are institutional things that are winding up propping him up, such things as people who know him in the party who are willing to give him the benefit of the doubt, such as the fact that older voters vote, such as half the party is moderate conservative, so on and so forth. So Biden's not just going away. He's not just going to fold. You're going to have to beat him. He's beatable. And we'll see what happens.
Okay. We'll begin seeing what happens next week, I guess.
Yeah, it's going to come up pretty soon. So anyway, while this is going on with that discussion by First Read and with the Chuck Todd thing, I said to Mark Murray, I wish this weren't such a cell phone for media. Mm-hmm. That Trump's excoriation of the Central Park 5 isn't nearly the big story that Biden got along with Eastland. Not that it shouldn't be a story, but First Read crew is trying to make the point that these are the advantages of being an incumbent. Trump can say stuff like this and we yawn. Biden says something like this and now he's on the defensive and so on and so forth. And, that's partly because that's how the media covers it. Dems are always in disarray. This is a front-runner stumbling story. It's going to be highly covered. I'm not arguing about that. It should be. But how they cover Trump when he dismisses his Central Park 5 as guilty is like, ho-hum, another story, just a mere blip in the Trump outrage. Well, that's media's fault.
Golly. Yeah. Yes. I mean, I guess.
And Mark Murray comes back and says, but it's not just the media. Compare the number of 2020 Dem statements on Biden versus Trump's Central Park 5 comment. Well, now, I don't know if he means that's because the Democrats aren't attacking Trump over this, but he certainly could have meant, maybe should have meant. But of course, the Republican Party is in full lockstep with Trump and never criticizes him, and therefore we don't see it, so we can't cover it.
Yes.
But that's an indictment of the Republican Party and the fact that the press isn't writing that every day, instead of Dems in disarray stories every day, which they're always looking for.
Yeah, well, that's true. We've been over this ground before, but it's worth discussing.
Because they do it all the time.
Yeah, chicken and egg. And
this is a perfect example of how that works, but that's okay. The fact of the matter is, it is a story. Biden does have to defend those comments. How he reacts to it is something the public wants to see, the voting public who is considering who to vote for wants to see, and that's all fine.
Yeah.
But it's really, Biden is being covered the old way, and Trump is being covered the old way, and it doesn't work for Trump because the old way doesn't allow you to say that he lies. The old way doesn't allow you to concentrate your coverage on the concentration camps and not make it a one-day story and move on to something else.
Yeah.
right? And so, something else is always going to come up. It might be the fact that we're going to war with Iran. That's kind of an important story. I get covering that, but I saw how media did that with Iraq, so I'm not so, happy about what's coming.
Yeah.
In all of this, the biggest story might well be that Iran war and how that's covered. I saw Arthur Raddatz describing the fact that the Iranians allegedly shot down a U.S. drone as yet another provocation by Iran. That's how she described it on the air.
Who did?
Martha Raddatz.
Martha Raddatz. Okay. Yet another. All right.
Right. ABC. It's their foreign/war correspondent. And, why are you calling it a provocation? That is propaganda language. It's an
yeah, I guess that's true. I mean, it's an officer involved shooting.
Did you know that the Iranians did it?
Did I know, or do I know that they did it? Do I know it was them?
Because
could have been a 400-pound guy.
Because Mike Pompeo said so.
Oh yeah, right. That's a problem.
I mean, it's like automatically accepting everything they said at face value, Gulf of Tonkin, and then reporting it as a provocation.
And another provocation at that, since the first provocation, if it was one, is in question anyway.
So you're looking at this and tearing your hair out and saying, you're going down this route again. Why are you buying everything they say at face value?
That is true. They are particularly bad at providing proof of their claims, and it seems like we keep forgetting, or some people keep forgetting that.
Well, give us a week. We have to doctor the videos.
Yeah, I guess so. That's true.
Can't do it right away. We'll get to you.
Everyone's worried about, I keep seeing warnings about what deep fakes will mean for the 2020 election, and I guess it's time to start worrying about what that'll mean for the Iran war. Yeah, I guess so.
Why should you assume anything?
There really is no reason. And,
we can have Colin Powell present at the UN. That might do it.
Yeah, well, everyone believes that usually, right? That'll work again, I think.
It did at the time.
Fool me twice, I say. Hi, it's me, David Waldman, your host for Kagro in the Morning, with a brand new interruption to say thanks to all of you who support the show. Remember when I told you that our average monthly donation was about $7, for which you were getting 2 great hours of news and entertainment 5 days a week, and how that came out to about 70 cents an hour? That's a pretty good deal, except it's wrong. The math actually works out closer to 17 cents an hour. It is hard to beat a deal like that, and even harder to send your kids to college on it. Thankfully, Patreon.com makes it easy to make that work. Patreon, Patreon.com, is the simple, secure way to make recurring monthly contributions to support our show. Just search for me or the show name on the site, and they make it easy to crowdfund the show so that the power of our numbers can keep the show going for just a few bucks a month. Once again, thanks so much for all your support.
Right. Yeah.
Welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. We might as well continue our break discussion. But I don't know, do we want to set that aside for the moment, or did we have something to launch into right after the break? Or
well, I would turn to the Trump side of things. This is a Peter Winter, conservative.
I'll make a note for myself.
Compassionate conservative type, along with Michael Gerson, from the original W administration. He has an op-ed. Trump is betting that anger can still be power. Trump 2020 may sound a lot like Trump 2016, but this time around, the fusion of president and party is complete. I like it for that observation. Again, as we said before the break, it's not just a question of what Trump does, it's a question of what Republicans acquiesce in. And we have to be clear. It's not a mistake or an error or an oops when the Republican Party supports the most ridiculous things that Trump does. It's that staying in power and keeping power happens to be their business model.
Yes. Well,
and we just have to recognize that. That's true for both parties. And we were talking about that in the context of how the House Democratic leadership structures things to protect their members and stay in power. But that's not necessarily breaking the law. It's merely breaking House rules. The Republicans are more than happy to break the law. So there's a big difference there. Just as there's a big difference between prisons and jails on the one hand and concentration camps on the other. One's inside the law, the other's outside the law.
Right.
One has
That's a
all
good
the
point.
law protections of the Constitution, at least as interpreted by the Trump Supreme Court, and the other doesn't have to answer to those things in quite the same way. And so, that's why it's such a big issue, and that's why Chuck Todd stepped in it when he decided that he was going to decide what this means.
Yes.
And, of course, got it wrong. But, that's another story for another day, and that day was yesterday. This particular article talks about how unpopular Trump is. But as we saw Tuesday night during a huge raucous rally in Orlando, Florida, I didn't see it because I don't watch those things anymore, and a lot of the networks didn't really cover it.
Yeah, that was
Trump
nice.
is viewed by his supporters, underline that, by his supporters, almost as a demigod. That's those the groupies that go from concert to concert. One excited Trump supporter who was there told me he was overwhelmed by the unwavering support for Mr. Trump, driven by a sense Mr. Trump has been deeply wronged. Mr. Trump sounds like Michael Cohen testifying on Saturday Night Live. By the Mueller investigation, by the media, and by what he described as anti-Trump forces. He also told me, based on conversations he had with others at the rally, that Mr. Trump supporters believe his era is spiritually driven. What he meant is that person after person reported that when it comes to Trump and the presidency, God has chosen him as protecting him. It's the children of light against the children of darkness. This is what happens when you talk to evangelicals. Don't get carried away by thinking that's the entire population.
I hope not, boy.
But it's interesting from Peter Wenner's point of view because, again, he's the compassionate conservative doing this out of religion kind of view.
I guess that's his beat. It has to be interesting.
Right? That's his beat. Exactly right. It's not just that Mr. Trump is exceedingly popular among Republicans with his approval rating this year hovering in the high 80s, low 90s. It's that he's won their undying loyalty and affection. As a Republican friend of mine put it to me recently, Mr. Trump is a general leading the army into battle against an enemy that needs to be vanquished for the good of the nation. It's an existential threat. We hear that all the time now. There's no room for public dissent.
Got a lot of them.
We're expected to treat him with reverence, submission, obeisance, or you'll be treated as a traitor to king and cause. Just ask Jeff Flake, Bob Corker, Mark Sanford, and Justin Amash. This is the same Trump who's like the sleazy crook in New York. That's what's so bizarre about it, and that's why I say their business model is power.
Evangelical. Right, and the other evangelicals who are backing him, for instance, are constantly finding themselves arrested for child porn or domestic violence or having naked pictures of their wives circulating, what have you.
The most withering line, says Weiner, at least it was for him, came from one of the Democratic candidates, Pete Buttigieg, who referred to Vice President Mike Pence, an outspoken evangelical Christian, as a cheerleader for the porn star presidency.
Yeah, all right.
That was actually a pretty good line. Many of those who during the Bill Clinton presidency insisted character and personal integrity were essential qualities in political leaders, like Lindsey Graham.
Character counts.
Have in the Trump era decided such matters are utterly unimportant.
Yes.
I guess so. They're complicit in the debasement of American culture and politics, which is true, and I like that he's pointing the finger at the Republican Party.
Yeah,
all of this has come at a crushing price, including driving away young people in huge numbers. And by the way, if Evan Siegfried was right, I read a little bit of his piece the other day. He says the over 65s are being driven away as well. The Trump ascendancy has made far too many Republicans increasingly contemptuous, a serious intellectual and policy argument, indifferent to empirical truth, disdainful of governing, and, by the way, it offends him because it offends his idea of what a compassionate conservative is. He didn't write that, but he didn't need to. They prefer to turn politics into an ongoing freak show, but the greater price is the indelible stain in this on the integrity of a party many of us once believed in, served in, and took pride in. So it's a complete takeover of the Republican Party. Healing and renewal can't begin until the party rejects the malignancy of Trumpism and embraces the belief that politics is not only a necessary activity but a noble calling, imperfect but essential way to advance justice. That day may yet come. Right now it feels light years away. If you're a Republican or were a Republican, probably feels that way to you. I still think we're on track for winning again in 2020. I'm okay with that. And I totally appreciate why stuff like what Joe Biden says is offensive. And, he needs to deal with it. And if he can't, he won't be the nominee.
Okay. Yeah.
But on the Republican side, they're lost.
Yes.
Anybody who still sticks with them at this point,
I hope so.
Forget it.
Yeah. I would, I guess, caution folks, of course, no revelation here, but getting past Trump won't fix your party. I mean, there's a reason why Trump worked.
Yeah,
Your
because
people
there's
are
something
terrible.
wrong with your party. There's something wrong with the evangelicals who are now the base of the party. And people that don't recognize that completely miss the boat about what the Republican Party is all about. That's why I like Winter's piece. He kind of describes what their thinking is without actively saying, you know what, the problem is the evangelicals. But you know what? The problem is the evangelicals.
Yeah, and I wonder, I mean, I guess that's been part of their rise to power is that given, what evangelicals do in their spare time, I mean, not the part that they're trying to cover up, but the part they try to project to everybody else, their piety is part of their shield. It's their disguise. You can't, you line up behind us because we're unimpeachable as evangelicals, because who can feel good as conservatives about pointing to and complaining about people who supposedly pray all the time? That's a good thing, right?
Yeah.
So I guess that's how they get away with it. And they're only now coming to the realization that they actually spend the bulk of their time either lying about everything, ignoring everything, or if they're in leadership, photographing their orgies, I guess. That's an odd thing to do.
Yep.
But you can be forgiven at the end, so it's a great deal, really.
Yeah. And all part and parcel of what's going on. This is an interesting piece that E.J. Dionne wrote. Moderate Democrats own their mistakes.
Yes, that's their problem, some say.
Some say. This is Democratic pragmatism, third way.
Aww.
John Cowan, the group's president, brought the point home by warning that outside cobalt blue districts and states can't afford a strategy aimed mainly at the furthest left Democrats. The danger is what we pursue, an approach that runs up the score in blue pieces but falls short everywhere else. And that's what you'd expect from people, EJ says, who have been battling people like Bernie Sanders the entire time. But what came later in Cowan's speech may have been the larger and more important revelation. The group is not offering, quote, a warmed-over 1990s centrism, end quote. Cowan's critique of what were, after all, the years of the Bill Clinton presidency was not hedged. Back then, we placed too much trust in the market's ability to provide a reliable and realistic path to prosperity for most Americans. In the last 30 years, we've seen the impact of globalization and automation on our workers. And it's clear that a rising tide will not lift all boats. So basically, he's taking the point of view that the meritocracy, manipulating the markets, is going to help everybody, and realizing that this led to economic inequality. And you might say that that's third ways coming to grips with what Occupy started all those years ago, if not very effectively as a group. That concept, that's an Overton window thing. And that concept has made its way even into the centrist thinking. And that's pretty remarkable, actually.
Yes. What are we reading?
And that's not an endorsement of third way. It's the idea that the markets will take care of it and just trust the Wall Street donors to fix things.
Well, yeah, I think we're done with that, thankfully. But
we are.
I guess that's part of the.
But I'm saying that it's interesting. Remember, those moderate conservative parts of the party, half of the party, it's nice to see them get that idea as well.
Uh-huh.
The new attitude toward the economy's shortcomings is as much about the realities on the ground as it about any ideological awakening, E.J. Dionne points out. Nonetheless, we have to own some of the mistakes of the New Democrats of the Clinton era, says John Cowan. And that's true.
Okay.
Underestimating the impact of trade liberalization, the speed and ferocity in which technology would decimate certain sectors of the American workforce. This is a case where you actually are allowed to use the term neoliberal because it applies.
Oh.
And it's a bit of a. Are
we really allowed to use any terms?
Yeah.
I'm not certain about that.
Just ask Lewis Carroll. They mean whatever you want them to mean.
I'll ask Chuck Todd. We'll see.
Mm. But this mea culpa pointed to a new implicit party consensus. You don't have to be a democratic socialist to believe that today's capitalism needs a spell in the repair shop. That opens the door to how you approach healthcare. That's why it's important.
Uh-huh. Oh, okay.
Right? And so the party is having an argument about perception right now. Okay? Uh-huh. And it's an interesting one, because when you look at all of the polls and you ask about Medicare for all, it's very popular, but that's only because people don't really understand what it is.
Oh, well, it sounds great.
It sounds great, but they think it means Medicare buy-in, otherwise you keep your insurance if you want your insurance. That's actually Medicare for America more than Medicare for all. Medicare for All would get rid of the insurance companies. People don't know that.
They should call it, do you want some Medicare?
Yeah, but, so why is that? Is it because the Democratic Party and the country as a whole want Medicare buy-in but keep everything else? If you think that that's the case, then Medicare for All is doomed, because that's not what it is. And if you're a Medicare for All supporter, you can't be allowed to think that. It must be messaging.
Well, I think I just did a better messaging job. At least I can't help the Medicare for All side, I guess.
Well, that's the thing, right?
Yeah. But do I have to?
No, you don't have to. And Medicare for All doesn't necessarily have to be the thing that gets done. And Bernie Sanders may not be the nominee. And, so for all of those reasons,
not if Abby has anything to say about
it's not necessary to say, okay, it's just a messaging issue. It might be important to recognize what it is that people actually want, which, of course, is nuanced health care. And they're a bit concerned and afraid, because if you tell them that that's what Medicare for All is, if you explain what the different programs are, it becomes less popular. And, of course, the Medicare for All people say, well, that's because you didn't explain it the right way. I didn't like the poll question. I didn't like the way it was, You start hearing that and you scratch your head and say, okay, that means you're losing.
Okay, I can get that.
Right? So it's not to be dismissed. I'm not trying to be dismissive of it. But the fact of the matter is that what people are really asking for is universal coverage, and allow me to buy into Medicare. If that's the way that you get universal coverage, we're okay with that. Meanwhile, the Trump campaign and the Trump administration is trying to get rid of Medicaid.
Yeah, okay, that's
limited
what they do.
And work requirements, do things like in Arkansas that make it so nobody has it. And so the argument about Medicare for All versus Medicare for America pales in comparison to, well, let's just get rid of the whole thing. Let's just overturn the Affordable Care Act and get rid of Medicaid, which is the Republican side. And don't forget, Donald Trump promises to have a new improved way to do this any day now.
Yes,
probably the day after the next election.
Right. That was promised.
I had a secret plan to end the Vietnam War. Been there, done that, so don't be.
Yeah, it is 2019 right now, and he did promise that in 2015. That was almost right out of the gate. After he told us the Mexicans were rapists, the next thing he said was, I'm going to have a beautiful health care for everybody. And, basically one of those, it's going to be so great your head will spin sort of promises. And then repeal. And then tomorrow, 2 weeks, very soon, almost there. By the way, have you seen what Hillary Clinton did? She should be locked up.
Right. Anyway, that's my segment for today. Just trying to tie all of this stuff together. We know we're going to have a united Republican Party. We know that they're going to be driven by existential threat, at least the way they see it.
Say so, anyhow, yeah.
We talked about that last week or the week before in terms of how the new conservatives are approaching the older conservatives like David French, because they're too wishy-washy and too nice. This is all part of that. It's an existential threat. Abortion is an existential threat. The Democrats are an existential threat. That part of the party is going to be totally solid for Donald Trump. It's easily 75% of Republicans, which is why he gets his high 80s support from the Republican Party. That still leaves 10% or so that may peel off depending. But 75% of them, of the Republican Party, never will. That's a small segment of American voters. We're talking about 35% or less. And so that's why, even though they are totally devoted to him and somehow that impresses the reporters covering the rallies, that doesn't mean that you win elections. Even in 2016, a lot of stuff had to line up in a black swan kind of way in order for Trump to win. That included Comey and Russian interference and, having Hillary Clinton as a foil, who people were conditioned not to like. And, as we talked about yesterday, a certain degree of misogyny in the country and the party that still exists. And when you're talking about whatever the percentage is, 10%, 20%, as the poll suggested yesterday in the Democratic Party, that must mean a lot higher in the rest of the country. Then, you're up against, forces that make it difficult to win. Would have won anyway, in my view, without Comey. But going into the 2020 election, you're going to have a small but united Republican Party, and you're going to have a larger but fractious Democratic Party, because that's the way we are. The parties are asymmetric. It's always been that way. going back to Will Rogers. We're not an organized party. We're Democrats. And that's what we're approaching. And so as we start to tear apart the candidates in a good way who are running to be the nominee, you got to expose their flaws. But the flaws to Democrats are not flaws to the country. So Biden has some issues here getting through the Democratic primary that actually may not hurt him in the general election.
Maybe not.
But he may not get there.
Yeah. Well, that's the game we set up.
That's the game we set up.
Yeah, he set it up, right. As a matter of fact. I saw somewhere mentioned this morning, he is the candidate, I guess he's the longest politically active presidential candidate in history, possibly. He's been active in politics the longest. I mean, he's run for president 100 times.
He's very experienced. He knows how to lose.
He's done it a lot, at least for president. That's true.
But he's also won.
Yes, well, in some
That's what happens when you have a 50-year career.
Some you win, some you lose.
Pretty much. And that was what you said eventually leadership winds up telling the members at some point.
That's true. You can't always get what you want, Joe.
You can't always get what you want. Exactly
That's
right.
True.
I'll leave you with that
presidency is nice
in that philosophy.
Yes.
And I'm trying not to get too emotionally invested in what happens with the Democratic side. I am totally emotionally invested in beating Trump, and that's still my main thing. And no, there's no way to pick and choose what electability means. That's another word that maybe Chuck Todd should define for us because the rest of us can't. But like I said, Potter Stewart did.
Yes.
I don't know what it is, but I know it when I see it.
Yes. Oh, by the way, the E.J. Dionne that you were reading to us, I'm having trouble. I don't see it on Skype. Is it in this list?
Not yet. I
okay. All right.
Please stumbled on it. Now it is.
Okay. Well, great. Okay. I just wanted to remind you then to send that to me, and I'm not completely blind to it being here already. Okay. Thanks very much.
Right. So it was a relatively short list today. Oh, there's one other thing I wanted to just mention because I think it was fascinating. Maybe you can do this later. It's in an Associated Press. I happen to pull it from the Hartford Courant, but it's an AP article. Nobody died at Sandy Hook. That's the title of a book.
A bad book.
That is the title from a bad book. It's been pulled from the shelves as victim's father wins defamation lawsuit.
Huh. Okay. It was on what shelves? What kind of shelves was this thing on?
Well, the point is the publisher of this book purported to show that it was all crisis acting, Alex Jones style, was pushing this. And the court said, you can't do that. That's like you're defaming the parents by claiming that they lied about it.
Well, that's actually difficult to get done in this country. But I mean, I guess as blatant as an example as this is, like finally, every once in a while, we've been waiting for this. Not this specific instance, although this has been stuck in our craw for a long time.
But it's like the Alex Jones stuff. That's
How can you do this?
If you keep saying that stuff, there ought to be a law. Actually, there is. You violated it. You're guilty. And the publisher and the author had to apologize to the family.
Okay, I bet.
My face-to-face interactions with Mr. Posner. This is the father of one of the victims. Noah was a notable victim because his mother elected to have open casket.
Oh. Because
she wanted people to understand what happened. We've talked about that a bit and how difficult that is. Yeah. My face-to-face interactions with Mr. Posner has led me to believe that Mr. Posner is telling the truth about the death of his son, said Dave Harry, the principal officer at publisher Moonrock Books. I extend my most heartfelt and sincere apology to the Posner family because the courts told me I had to say that.
This publisher, anybody ever heard of Moonrock Books?
A summary judgment against this publisher who we never heard of, and the authors James Fetzer and Mike Palachuk.
My guess is that would have been that it was a self-published book, but it might amount to the same thing if it's, your buddy is the publisher, right? And they don't publish anything else. But still, okay. Well,
the fight was joined by others who lost relatives. After quietly enduring harassment and ridiculous assertions for years, some have changed their approach, deciding the only way to stop it is to confront it. The efforts have turned the tables on the hoaxers, including Alex Jones, host of the conspiracy-driven InfoWars website. Who was it? I can't remember whether it was Facebook or Twitter. Dumped Natural News, which was another conspiracy site.
Oh, I don't think I know about that one, but it sounds like we're hearing those sorts of stories.
Robbie Parker, who I worked with at the hospital, whose 6-year-old daughter, Emily, were among the 21st graders and 6 educators kicked killed at Sandy Hook, spent years ignoring people who called him a crisis actor. His family moved to the West Coast, but the harassment didn't stop. He would get letters from people who found his address. He was once stopped in a parking garage by a man who berated him and said the shooting never happened. So he was part of the lawsuit against Alex Jones.
Okay.
And so the victims are starting to fight back, which is a very interesting sort of thing to happen. Remember, there was that Florida woman, Lucy Richards, who was sentenced to 5 months in prison for sending Posner death threats and banned by a judge from visiting websites run by conspiracy theorists, including the authors of this book.
They're going to do that. Okay.
Right? And, so it's all part of a bigger picture of not just ignoring it. And these sorts of things you can't ignore. Here's another terrible example, terrible in the sense that it happened. And that is that, I don't know if you've seen stories in the paper, but the Columbine high school officials are thinking about raising the school because they keep having these morbid, inspection tours.
Oh.
By who knows who.
Really?
Yeah.
I mean,
now for a different reason, the Sandy Hook school was raised and rebuilt because the families didn't want their kids going there.
Yeah.
But it also eliminated let's go see the site because, it's on our shooting memorial tour.
Yeah, right. Now to file that alongside the people who are apparently, although this is in dispute, overrunning Chernobyl for selfies.
Yeah, so, I mean, so it's a thing.
I guess if you can do that. Yeah, but I mean, when they say tour, I guess tours at Columbine outside, like you're allowed to walk outside Columbine. I was going to say they don't have people touring the buildings, like they can control that.
No, but you had somebody who was armed who went there relatively recently.
Yeah, I could see how people would end up doing that, or even just goofy selfies outside wherever the sign is.
Here's the AP story on that, entitled 20 Years After Columbine, a debate on bulldozing the school.
Yeah, well...
Right? The buses full of tourists have mostly stopped over the years, but not the visitors. This year alone, security staff contacted more than 2,400 unauthorized people on Columbine's campus. And then, as I was referring to, a few days before the anniversary, a young woman described as obsessed with the attack flew to Colorado, bought a shotgun, killing only herself, but sparking lockdowns and new fears. So they may get rid of the school altogether.
Yeah, well, you're right. I mean, I guess that's an idea. Well, there's a million reasons why that's a terrible thing, but go ahead. I mean, I'll give you the money. Go ahead.
When you step back...
I'll approve that appropriation, even though
and look at the many ways that people have reacted to this. Grade school level new construction has been, quote, hardened, end quote. Mm-hmm. More security. You don't plant bushes just below the windows so people can sneak up on them, so on and so forth. Architects are designing schools with safety in mind.
Yeah. Right,
which makes them more expensive, but
well, yeah.
Some of the schools are pretty shoddily built anyway.
Safety, one thing, right? It's it's when you're.
You have lawsuits against the Alex Jones. I'm just giving you an example of things have changed, and it isn't just okay. They're going to shoot me now. I'm not going to do anything. That's the end of it. That's not what happens. Tremendous amount of gun law changes in the states at the state level. Even if the federal government doesn't do that much, lots of states have done lots of things, including Connecticut, and that's part of all of this. And I presume that'll be part, at least at some level, or at some point, for a question or two during the presidential debates. If not this one, then another one, along with climate change and all the other important things that we have to talk about, like what's your favorite color and would you want to have a beer with this person?
Yes, that's true. They should just have beer on the stage, by the way, I think.
Actually, they asked Ariel Everett-Levy was tweeting around this yesterday, but they actually asked a sort of a question.
Yeah.
About
not which beer would you be, right?
What do you do for comfort? Right. Gillibrand was the Scotch drinker, and I think Tim Ryan said ice cream. I mean, I saw that and said, I'm going to have to reconsider everything now.
Yes, it's very
I'm with
different.
Tim Ryan.
I like knowing these things about them. But I don't know.
Somebody wanted to have flavored tea. Okay, you're off my list.
Maybe there's nothing wrong with knowing.
Maybe.
I guess. It feels like, I didn't see that article only because there were so many people complaining about, well, it seems like such a waste of time and opportunity now to be discussing that, but those are things to know. No one makes their decision based on it, but other material is available. You can read that. And
Here, I'll give you somehow. Her tweet because it was pretty funny. All right.
Okay.
Because basically what she did is she had a couple of pictures of people. She called it the 4 personality types. Right?
Okay.
Marianne Williamson said, okay. I have no comfort food. Right.
Okay.
I am not voting for her.
I don't know if I have anything.
By the way, she's an anti-vaxxer.
Oh, well.
That's besides the point.
Okay.
I'm not voting
no, it
for
isn't.
Her.
Okay.
Right. But it's because she doesn't have comfort food.
I guess so. She doesn't need any because she's
Ryan
never
says,
ill.
I'm an ice cream guy. Okay, Tim, you are my personality type. Eric Swalwell said, I have a comfort drink, which is iced tea. All right, nice try.
Oh, all right, yeah.
Right, Kirsten Gillibrand said, glass of whiskey at the end of the night. Okay, that's going to get a lot of votes.
Sure, right.
So there's your basic 4 personality types, and you can decide which one you fit into.
Okay.
All right, that's my segment. That'll take you right up till 10 a.m. And then you got to figure out what to do from now on.
I got to find something for comfort, I guess.
Yeah.
I wouldn't know what to say to that.
I don't do comfort stories.
Yeah, okay. So that was not did not happen. You never heard it here, first or otherwise.
I see somebody tweeting, concentration camps is a loaded term that many, especially MAGA supporters, object to. So to stay focused, it's really best to call them Trump properties.
I guess so. And you know what happens to those?
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Nobody wants those. All right. Wow. Well, that's a good way of ending things. Thanks very much for bringing us up to the 10 o'clock hour. Maybe this is a good day for just quickly running through headlines after the in-depth investigation yesterday. So there's an awful lot to catch up on.
Okay. We'll what's happening Monday? You on?
Yes. Why?
You're not going to camp. You don't have vacation.
No.
It's getting to be that time of year.
No, but it occurs to me that, Thursday and Friday of next week, I'm going to have to come up with some sort of a plan. That is parent and freshman orientation at the college level.
Just see? I knew it was something.
Right.
Take care. David will be back after the break. This is Greg Dworkin with David Waldman, and we'll see you next week.
All right. Great. Thanks again, Greg. Have a good weekend. We'll be right back in 1 minute. The short break is coming up. Welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. Let's say just catching up on all of the excitement that is happening this morning on Twitter and the number of things. I feel like I tucked an inordinate number of, inordinate number? Can it be an inordinate number, an inordinate amount? Maybe that's, I don't know. Anyway, a lot of unusually high number, I think, of stories stored away in Pocket and retweeted yesterday. And I feel like we have to touch on 1,000 of them. Although, maybe some of them I'll want to save for full readings, and maybe that would make good Thursday and Friday programming. I don't know. Anyway, let's see. We'll have to decide how we want to approach these things. I guess... man, there's an awful lot happening here. To go back to what I was discussing earlier in the segment with Greg, I guess just to bring ourselves up to speed. Where did I put the story away? There's so many of them in here. I have to scroll and scroll and scroll to see whether the story itself is in here or not. I guess it's not. So I'll have to go to the tweet stream. But I think I retweeted the story behind the discussion that we began earlier about procedure. Yes, here it is. And I know the story must be in here somewhere. I'm pretty sure I remember clicking on it. But so last night I saw Matt Fuller from HuffPost tweeting that the House just passed a nearly $1 trillion appropriations bill that includes 11 very crucial lines. They were, of course, the repeal of the 2001 authorization for the use of military force. This is the first time a repeal of the 2001 AUMF has passed the House. It's been attempted before. Almost 18 years after it was enacted. And then, of course, there was a story that they published on it, and that's why I'm puzzled as to how come I can't find the thing. Maybe I need to look for the HuffPost in here. There it is. It's not immediately obvious. It's a photo of of Nancy Pelosi with Barbara Lee, whose proposal this was, and the headline reads, 18 years later, the House finally repeals the president's 9/11 war authority. So I didn't see AUMF anywhere, and I didn't see, the keywords I was looking for. So that's a story in itself. Plus, of course, there's the procedural angle. Well, let's look at this one here. Matt Fuller and Amanda Turco put this one together. And this, it's not a separate story from procedure all by itself. I don't have to lay it alongside the Hyde Amendment to make it a procedural story. 18 years later, the House finally repeals the president's 9/11 war authority. But how hard are Democrats willing to fight to actually prevent war is the question posed as masquerading as a subheader here. The House Democrats passed a nearly $1 trillion appropriations bill on Wednesday, complete with funding for the military, health programs, and the energy department. You see how they mix and match the departments, not always in obvious combinations either. But 11 lines in the 667-page bill could literally be the difference between war and peace, life and death. A repeal of the 2001 authorization for use of military force. Right in the middle of reading that, I found cause for hesitation. Under other administrations, Democratic administrations, for instance, one might think that the repeal of the authorization for use of military force might prove an impediment to entering into a new war. Maybe. It's not entirely clear. Under Republican administrations, not so much. And they like to have that, and they'll do things, and they'll lean on AUMF while it's there. And when it's not, they'll simply say, well, we have the inherent authority to do it anyway, and what are you going to do about it? So there is that. But you might as well start with the on the technical level and say, well, we'll at least get rid of the authorization so that we won't have to argue about whether or not we mistakenly authorized this action. We didn't. We had an authorization on the books. We got rid of it to make things extraordinarily clear, not that you would have honored it or not that Republicans thought that it was necessary to have either. I mean, great to have it. George W. Bush was happy to have it, made things a lot easier for him, but he likely would have attempted to do what he wanted to do even without it. And Trump will do the same, but, all things being equal, then why not try to repeal it along the way? Now, it sets up a political and procedural and strategic battle because, of course, the Senate is unlikely to go along with it, nor would President Trump necessarily go along with it, although you'd think that he would say, you know what, I'll sign it. What do I care? I mean, I don't recognize the importance of an AUMF to begin with. So what's the big deal? So that'll make for an interesting fight. 3 weeks after the 9/11 terrorist attacks, you remember the history of this stuff, lawmakers overwhelmingly, 420-1 in the House, and you know who the 1 was, 98-0 in the Senate, and you know who the 0 was. We'll throw that in there too. That's the margin by which they approved the AUMF, the 2001 AUMF. There have been others. The text of the resolution is incredibly broad. Congress gave the president the authority to use, quote, all necessary and appropriate force, whatever that is, to go after the, quote, nations, organizations, or persons, unquote, who were involved in the 9/11 terrorist attacks. But there's more. The resolution also gave the president the authority to go after anyone who, quote, harbored those people, and more quoting here, in order to prevent any future acts of international terrorism against the United States, unquote. Not many lawmakers anticipated that 18 years later, the United States would still be using the 2001 AUMF to justify military action all over the globe. Well, I think a few did. 3 different presidents have used the AUMF for more than 36 different military engagements in 14 different countries, which is not hard to anticipate. If the target can be anybody, so long as it's somehow related to terrorism, or maybe even not. Seriously, even though there was only one person who voted against it, I don't know that it's the case necessarily that there weren't many lawmakers who anticipated that this thing could be used forever in many, many ways. One thought it was so daunting a possibility, or arguably thought so, so much so that they voted against it all alone, Barbara Lee. But I would not have a hard time believing at all that there were a dozen, 2 dozen, 3 dozen more who thought, I am really, really nervous that this could be used forever for perpetual war, because it's written for perpetual war. But no one in my district can, at this point, so close after 9/11, can countenance their federal representative not allowing the president to pursue military options right now under these circumstances, and holding out for better language, which was never going to be forthcoming from that Congress, or any future imaginable Congress, quite honestly, means that you would just be, you know how people were being labeled. And if you were anti-war, then you didn't support the troops, and you hated America, and you were objectively pro-Saddam, or whatever. I don't think we were at the pro-Saddam stage yet, but eventually we would get there, and it wouldn't take very long. So let's get back to the article anyway. And now, with President Donald Trump and his administration strongly signaling they would use the 2001 AUMF, because why not, it's there, to justify a new war with Iran, the newish Democratic majority controlling the House is taking its most serious step to repeal the War Authority. Included in the base text of the Appropriations Bill, and that's kind of important, it's in the base text, that is to say, Barbara Lee didn't come to the Rules Committee and ask for for protection for an amendment to allow to include language repealing the AUMF. So she didn't have to go through that process. She went through instead a parallel process in which she got the language included in the original draft, or at least the reported draft of the Appropriations Bill itself. And let me just look something up here. Look at where will we find out? What is she on the Appropriations Committee? I don't know whether that's true or not, and that would be the easiest way to get something like that in, as a member of the committee would do. Do we have committee assignments here in the Wikipedia? Yeah, there we are, committee assignments. Let's see. Yeah, okay, so she's an appropriator. So that basically answers that. That's usually an exclusive committee, but I see she also happens to sit on the Budget Committee, which seems unusual to me. But anyway, so that's the easiest way to get it done. Otherwise, I guess I would have said, well, what's interesting here is we're crediting Barbara Lee for it, and it was probably her idea. But if she wasn't on the Appropriations Committee, that means she would have had to enlisted the assistance of someone who was. And ordinarily that amendment, well, the credit then goes to them. But she was able to do it herself directly here. Okay, so that's good news. That explains a lot. Anyway, the point is that there are 2 or 3 back doors into legislation. The earliest one that presents itself in the legislative process is being on the committee, or even better, being the chairperson of that committee. But when a bill is initially considered, I guess I make that the first back door into the bill because, I guess the original front door into the bill is I wrote the bill, right? See, you know how it starts. A congressperson writes a bill. Now, there's a whole series of steps that goes into that, and good reason to believe that it's probably more accurate and descriptive to say that somebody else is writing the bill under the auspices of this congressperson. But for now, we'll just say, for simplification purposes, Congressperson X writes the bill, drops it in the hopper. It's referred to the blank committee, in this case, the Appropriations Committee. Although, again, in the appropriations context, it's very rarely the case that anyone sits down and starts writing a list of numbers and says, this will be my bill. They don't actually necessarily do it that way. They sort of do things upside down and backwards in a lot of committees, and appropriations would be one of them, where they basically say, well, let's start having some hearings and meetings about how we want to handle appropriations, and then we'll translate that into legislative language, and at some later point we'll drop the bill itself. The committee will decide what should be in it first. And I guess that's what makes appropriations bills such a mess, right? Everybody always derides things that are written by committee. Appropriations bills are written by committee. They're not, Congressman Jones says, these are the things I think we should spend on 10 billion different programs. What do you guys think? And then they haggle over that. That's not the starting point. For the most part, that you'll just to learn some terminology along the way, right? In the appropriations context in particular, you will hear more about the chairman's mark. That is the bill that they get the committee together to consider submitting for consideration on the House floor has to begin somewhere. And the chairperson of the committee is the one who takes responsibility for driving these things. And they will submit basically a discussion draft. So it got slightly more weight than a discussion draft. But that's because it's been written by the chairperson, and the chairperson carries a lot of weight, right? So that's how these things come to pass. Now, it may be that Barbara Lee spoke to the chair or spoke to the chair of the subcommittee that she sits on. And there are 3 on which she sits. Subcommittee on Labor, Health and Human Services, Education and Related Agencies. That's not this one in this case. The Subcommittee on State, Foreign Operations and Related Programs. And then the Subcommittee on Military Construction and Veterans Affairs. And I guess that's not any of these, right? What did the HuffPost, although this was a combination of 2 bills. That makes things even more annoying and complicated. But what did they say here? This was military, health programs, and the energy department. So maybe one of her bills could have been maybe the military construction one. I don't know. But it could have been the defense bill, which is separate from military construction and veterans affairs, believe it or not. But anyway. Point is, she may have spoken to whoever was putting together the chairman's mark and said, let's include this language in there. It could have been discussion among the committee members. This is a very fine list of things we want to pay for, but let's slip in this other thing. Using, as I said, the first of the back doors into legislation, including it in the original draft of the bill or the chairman's mark that gets reported out. And now you're carrying that very important must-pass Appropriations Bill to the floor, and it has to go first to the Rules Committee, who will decide how long it'll be debated for and what amendments will be in order to it. That presents backdoor number 2. We will, if I am outside of the committee, or even if you're inside the committee, if you can't get agreement for whatever reason, or you come up with it as a late idea and it doesn't make it in time, but you think it's an important one, typically members of the committee who have the chairperson's backing to add an amendment will show up at the Rules Committee with that endorsement in their pocket, and then wave it around, and the Rules Committee will say the chairperson wants it, we'll allow that amendment. This is a rogue amendment that lost in committee and the chairperson opposes. We maybe, depending on the political situation, disallow that amendment. But the safest way to do it is to include it in the original draft of the bill, and I think that's probably innately obvious to everyone, but procedurally speaking, it grants it the greatest measure of protection because, one, you don't have to plead your case with the Rules Committee. because usually when the chairman's mark shows up at the Rules Committee for a discussion on the rule, if there's language in there that's controversial, it's presumed to have the chairperson's approval. Otherwise, it wouldn't have gotten into that chairman's mark in the first place. But you can have that side discussion if necessary, if there's any question about it. And generally speaking, the text of the bill is protected. The only tinkering that's likely to be allowed in the House around the margins would be through the amendments process, and even that is pretty tightly controlled. So kudos to Barbara Lee for getting that done. But like I said, it's basically the same play. It doesn't involve the amendment process, but it's basically the same thing. The rule for debate of this appropriations bill was very clear, and we can read a little bit of it later on in case there's any question about it. But now I'm in danger of spending another hour on the same subject. Let's just read on here. There was of course, initial overwhelming support for the 2001 AUMF, but it was very broad and maybe overbroad, and not very many lawmakers anticipated how it is thought, perhaps, anticipated how long this would be in use for and for what sorts of activities. Now, of course, Donald Trump planning on using it for Iran. Included in the base text of the Appropriations Bill is a provision that would repeal the 2001 AUMF 8 months after the legislation is enacted. That is, 8 months after the Appropriations Bill is enacted. Why then is a good question. Why not immediately? I don't know. It was probably proposed as immediate and they couldn't get agreement on it. Maybe that's it. And 8 months was the compromise. I don't know. I mean, that seems like a pretty big window. It is a significant development in Congress trying to restrain Trump and many of his most hawkish advisors' thirst for war. And it's the first time the House has passed a repeal of the 2001 AUMF. But this bill, this is the important part, according to the authors and their hint in the subheader, this bill is almost certainly not the bill that will make it to Trump's desk. This is the first serve in an appropriations ping-pong match between the Democratic House and the Republican Senate. Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, much less Trump, is unlikely to accept such a repeal, and there's serious doubt among Democrats that their leadership would risk a shutdown over Senate Republicans refusing to repeal the 2001 War Authority. We are not the party of shutdowns, Representative Jamie Raskin told HuffPost this week. That is not our position. Okay. If Democrats aren't willing to risk a shutdown over repealing this 2001 military authorization, however, then they're almost already giving up the game. They may have found a gambit that could potentially limit the president's ability to go to war with Iran, but they face stiff opposition to a full-scale AUMF repeal, not just from McConnell and Trump, but also National Security Advisor John Bolton and Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. And even if they do plan to give up on repealing the 2001 War Authority, they could still face stiff opposition in pursuing a middle-of-the-road approach. The Trump administration is serious about a potential war with Iran. Bolton even said Monday that Congress would be making a big mistake if they doubted the president's resolve on this. You doubt the president on everything, his whether the resolve is the question or anything else. But okay. Next section of the article here is entitled "A Generational Divide on War?" ? Much has been made of the generational divide among House Democrats. Chuck Todd is making more of it right now. The top three leaders are in their late 70s and have collectively been in Congress for 94 years. They're thinking about it, obviously, the authors, quite a bit. They did the math on that. While many of the newest Democratic members are 3 generations younger and still setting up district offices. That means some of the newest members of Congress grew up with the Iraq War in the background of their high school and college years. Many of them opposed the invasion and saw politicians, many of whom are now colleagues, send their friends off to war. Despite the situation, Democrats swear there is no division. I think Democrats are pretty united, Representative Barbara Lee told HuffPost last week. Remember the 420-1 vote in the House to approve the 2001 AUMF? Lee was the one member who voted no. She had led the fight from the very beginning to repeal the authorization, and Lee genuinely believes Democrats of all ages and all congressional tenures are with her. We have to remember, Lee said, I believe it's only 20% of Congress serving today who served in 2001. So they may not be personally invested in that AUMF. And even if they were, they may have changed their mind about it since then. That's entirely possible. Over the course of more than 24 interviews with Democratic lawmakers of varying tenures, a generational divide on repealing the 2001 War Authority never emerged. That's interesting. So real work on the ground there. Very well done. Very few are on a different page, said Budget Chairman John Yarmuth of Kentucky, who is 71 and has been in Congress for the last 12 years. There's possibly some different points of view, but I've not seen it on generational grounds, said Representative Lloyd Doggett of Texas, who's been in Congress since 1995. I don't think there's any divide on that situation at all, freshman Representative Gil Cisneros of California said. I mean, okay, they're all statements that say that, and that's good. But it's interesting. They all just say there's no divide, but is that evidence that there's no divide? Some freshman members did say that they felt there was a new push within their class to repeal the 2001 AUMF, citing how many of them came of age during the early 2000s. Haley Stevens of Michigan recalled being in college at American University, walking into the student center and seeing on the TV the United States was going to war. When I look back, I'm no longer a college kid now. I'm a member of Congress, Stevens said, but I remember it very viscerally, and it's something to remember about our responsibility now in Congress, around the decisions that we make, around the bills that we're trying to pass. And freshman Representative Colin Allred of Texas, these are all Democrats, by the way, recounted watching President George W. Bush and his State of the Union address after 9/11 when he was a freshman at Baylor University and hearing Bush mention for the first time weapons of mass destruction. Now, let's see, 9/11, 2001, okay, so it would be the State of the Union, yes. Iraq is certainly in the back of our minds since they are looking like they're trying to rely on the same authorization of military force, he said. Representative Andy Kim of New Jersey, who worked on Barack Obama's national security team, said the Iraq War played a critical role in shaping his life and was a, quote, big reason why he entered the foreign policy field. But he also said that he was aware that there were risks in drawing parallels too closely between different conflicts, which is another reason why members feel a new AUMF is warranted. I want to draw from my personal experiences, but not impose my memories upon current circumstances. They're always going to be different, he said, and we can always just be thinking about this war as fighting the last war, which is usually not recommended. But it's not just freshmen who seem to be thinking about the mistakes of Iraq. As Representative Mark Takano of California, who's been in Congress since 2013, told HuffPost, I don't think anybody wants to blunder into or be manipulated into a war and have no choices. That is why, as the Trump administration provides classified briefings on Iran's aggression and its nuclear program, there's been strong pushback from members, both Democratic and Republican. Some members who spoke on condition of anonymity to describe the classified briefings said conversations were often combative, and it was concerning how strong some officials were playing to the drumbeat of war. Because of the threat of war with Iran, which would likely be an even more serious and bloody engagement than the war with Iraq that killed more than 4,000 Americans and wounded 32,000. No mention here, interestingly enough, for HuffPost of the killed and wounded on the other side, but okay. Members say it's more incumbent upon them than ever to repeal the 2001 AUMF. And I mean, that's actually good thinking just in terms of clarifying the mission of the Iran war. It's not really in keeping with the traditional definition of the spread of international terrorism, even though we like to, for political reasons and strategic reasons, designate Iran as a sponsor of terrorism. It's full-fledged governmental and official military activity, I think, has to be put pretty well outside the traditional definition of terrorism. But then, people will look at you cross-eyed and say, what's the point even of defining terrorism in traditional terms these days? And it's one of those nebulous claims with which it's very difficult to argue, and therefore may be actually effective. This is a very long article, and I don't know whether we can get all the way through it or not. But I'll scan it a little bit over the next break to see whether this last section is worth continuing in a procedural sense. A very interesting discussion. Obviously couldn't be skipped today. We could be forgiven for, at this point, moving on from there. We'll decide what we'll do with it over the next 2-minute breaks. I'll be contemplating it in radio silence. Hi, everybody. It's me, David. Let's change things up from the old fundraising pitch for just a minute and talk instead about how you can be a part of our show. If you've got a smartphone or any other electronic recording device, why not sit down and record a segment for us? Read us an important article and give us your take. Read one of your own original essays, or even just give us your commentary on something you'd like to share that's important to you. Then send the file to me at kagrox@gmail.com, and I'll try and work it into the show. Short segments, a few minutes in length, are easiest to fit in. And of course, I can't always guarantee that I'll be able to play everything, but if you've ever shouted at your radio or TV about something you wish was being covered, here's your chance to change that. Make the show your own. Send your submissions to me at kagrox@gmail.com. Welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. I've scanned things over, and I'm dismayed to say, actually, that I think maybe we have a real interest in continuing on in this one, and it may be that we get back to the procedural or background procedural part of the story here. Okay, next up, the section entitled The Iran Gambit. With potential strikes against Iran looming, Democrats and some Republicans have been trying not only to repeal the 2001 AUMF, but also specifically block action against Iran. So here's the different procedural and legislative avenues they've considered pursuing for all of this. During a recent markup of the National Defense Authorization Act, emphasis on that, again, it's the authorizing committee. This is the people who are supposed to be doing the legislating, setting policy, establishing and authorizing programs that appropriators later decide to pay for. During a recent markup of the National Defense Authorization Act, members debated an amendment that would clarify that the 2001 AUMF could not be used to justify, quote, kinetic military action in Iran. Kinetic action is things that go boom, Representative John Garamendi of California told HuffPost, adding that it meant bombs, missiles, guns, and other lethal force weapons. There was an effort to include the amendment in the bill that came out of the Armed Services Committee. That's the NDAA, National Defense Authorization Act. The Armed Services Committee is the authorizing committee in charge of what gets done in the armed services. There's a military appropriations, a Department of Defense appropriations bill that pays for it later on. If you can think back to yesterday's discussion of the bifurcated budgeting process. And even there, we run into trouble with the terminology because the budget is a totally different document and it means different things, but as a term of art, the budget is the budget resolution in Congress, not how much money we spend and where it goes, though that's authorization and appropriations. Okay, you get the idea. Or maybe you don't. It doesn't matter for now, I don't think. There was an effort to include this amendment about kinetic action in the authorization bill, but the authors, Representatives Ro Khanna of California and Anthony Brown of Maryland, also Seth Moulton, Massachusetts, and Garamendi, California, decided to withdraw it after Democrats and Republicans expressed concerns about the language. And maybe that's how we got to the 8-month thing. There's a lot of Dems who are concerned about this stuff. Chairman Adam Smith assured the members they would get a floor vote on a similar amendment when the annual defense bill comes to the floor in mid-July. And Rules Committee Chairman, of course, because they play a role in this, Jim McGovern, confirmed to HuffPost on Tuesday that he plans to make such an amendment in order for debate. So separately, once again, a recap, an effort to include in the Defense Authorization Bill language that would, that would clarify that the 2001 AUMF could not be used to justify kinetic action in Iran. But it didn't get included. But the chairman of the committee said, well, I assure you that I will arrange to get a floor vote on an amendment to the bill approved in the Rules Committee. The Rules Committee will, take his word for it, very likely, and McGovern here confirms it. But interesting question up front there, right? Okay, if the chairman says we really ought to be voting on the floor, or we really ought to have, I guess, if you're going to have a vote on the floor, presumably you think, well, I don't know, presumably you think it belongs in the bill. But maybe you don't, right? If the chairman of the Defense Authorization, the Defense or Armed Services Committee, in writing the Defense Authorization Bill, says, I think there ought to be language in this bill, ultimately, that clarifies that you can't use the 2001 AUMF for kinetic action, I can't believe I'm using that phrase, in Iran, then put it in. So what explains his saying, well, I'll ensure that we get a floor vote on it, and the chairman of the Rules Committee agrees that we should have a floor vote on it, but why not put it in now? Well, a number of things could be happening. There's a number of committee members with concerns. Is it so many of them that it might have lost a vote in committee to include it in the markup, the original version of the bill, which would make it look like a loser of an issue and make it vulnerable to attack either by Republican amendment or not, whether it's attacked in the greater political arena, like it would expose a possible split between Democrats, right? And it may be that the chairman personally supports including that language, but there are a significant number of members of the committee who either oppose it outright or have serious enough concerns about it that they would vote against including it. And the chairman needs to work with those people on various things and, essentially keep them relatively happy. You can sometimes impose your will on people, but sometimes not. You got to be able to read the room, right? So it could be that, or it could be, well, Democratic constituencies in general, including my own, definitely would react favorably to the proposal to block the use of the 2001 AUMF for kinetic action in Iran, or really for anything at all. A significant number of Democratic voters might very well like that. But Adam Smith might, for whatever reason, have a belief that this was somehow unwise or somehow overstepped his authority or somehow had, there was some negative repercussions attached to this that he could envision. But he doesn't want to say no to this constituency. So instead you say, oh no, I'm really on your side. I am going to guarantee that there is a floor vote on including that language. So you will have a chance then to call your representative, even if it's me, and urge them to vote for that amendment. And I intend to vote against that amendment, or I intend to whip votes against that amendment for reasons that I think are serious but complicated and won't go over very well in a town hall meeting in my district. Or it could also be, yes, I could include this in the language of the bill, but if that happens, it quietly passes and nobody comes to a town hall meeting and says, I am so glad that Adam Smith is so responsive to me, because they never read about it, or they don't, it's buried in the middle of this text and nobody discusses it except here on this show. So is it a strategic decision? Maybe he supports it 100%, but he knows that quietly including it in the bill One doesn't really get it done because you'll have a different version of it perhaps over in the Senate, or you could have the president vetoing it. And remember, a NDAA is not necessarily a must-pass bill. The appropriations don't have to be. Let's see, here's another place where rules play into things. You're not supposed to, in addition to, I guess, the flip side, the check and balance here in the bifurcated process, you're not supposed to legislate, as we know from yesterday, in an appropriations bill. Today, we'll learn that you're not supposed to appropriate in a legislative bill either, but that doesn't happen very often. But you're not supposed to, the Appropriations Committee is not supposed to appropriate money for unauthorized projects. So in other words, here's where the bifurcation process comes up again. If the authorizing committee, if the Armed Services Committee says, in our judgment, there should be no more F-35s built because you can see them, despite what the president says, let's say, something like that. But the Appropriations Committee says either, no, you can't see them and we believe the president, or more likely, I don't care whether you can see them or not, they are built in my district. Could appropriators then say, well, we don't care whether they're authorizing more F-35s or not. We're appropriating money to be used solely for that purpose, so they're going to get built. Well, could they? Yes. Should they? No. Do they sometimes anyway? Yes. Is there a point of order available against that provision when the appropriations bill is on the floor? Yes. You can strike that provision as an unauthorized appropriation. Can the Rules Committee say, to hell with you, we protect it, no such point of order is permissible? Yes, they can. So do they from time to time? You bet. Okay. Rules out the window when necessary, when desirable. Okay, so let's see. How did we get to that from jumping off in here? Well, okay, so that's right. There could be, I don't know exactly how we ended up on this, but I remember where we left off. The jumping off point was, what if Adam Smith, as chairman of the the Armed Services Committee, says, I absolutely agree that we should put this limitation on the 2001 AUMF. One way of doing it is to quietly slip it in the bill, and everything's fine, and nobody hears very much about it because it ends up in dense articles like this one. Or you have a dramatic floor fight for an amendment that he supported from the beginning, and that as chairman of the Armed Services Committee, he's very likely to be able to convince a majority of the House to include, and you get people to be to the point where they say, activists say, call your congressman and tell him you support the blah, blah, blah amendment to limit the 2001 AUMF to so that you can't use kinetic action in Iran. And it'll be a very popular one. Lots of people will call, and either at town hall meetings or responding to constituent calls, Adam Smith will be able to say, you have spoken and I've heard you, and then give his speech about why it's all right, and then very dramatically add this amendment. Now, there's also the next stage in which it could possibly be the case that Adam Smith actually personally prefers that this amendment not be passed into law, but he knows very well that his constituency wants it, and so they do things this way, and then they have the dramatic fight of an amendment being added, and the Republicans speak against it, and you grill them for it, and you come across as the hero, knowing very well that the Senate, if you actually oppose this thing, will save your bacon by refusing to include it in their version of the National Defense Authorization Act. And then they'll come to the point where, look, something has to be done here. We either have to have a compromise bill that gets to the president's desk and gets signed, or else all of the appropriations for military programs will be in danger as unauthorized appropriations, at which point you could remind them that doesn't matter because the Rules Committee can protect all of that. But we don't want to do those things because they're in violation of the House rules. We'll violate House rules on occasion, or even a minority of the number of times. We may even do it every day for every single bill, technically speaking, but we don't generally want to simply broad brush waive the requirement that appropriations be authorized ahead of time. Otherwise, that defeats the purpose of our bifurcated process. So, in all likelihood, they're all going to want to see the NDAA properly passed and adopted so that the appropriations for the military programs don't have to be specially protected and they don't have to feel awkward and embarrassed about all of that. The Senate will take care of it by not agreeing to put it in there, and the House will eventually agree to their version of it so as not to leave the Appropriations Bill in jeopardy. Or the president will veto it and send it back, and people will say, do we want to have that kind of fight with the appropriators and a possible shutdown as well if we never are able to get a military appropriations bill passed for lack of authorization and people who are sticklers for regular order, and we have a partial shutdown that includes the military as we're headed into this conflict with Iran. People won't want that. So there's a million moving parts and no way to tell where your chairman really is. I guess this is actually valuable discussion after deciding to do a lightning roundup of all these other stories. That's clearly out the window. But as I think ahead to next Thursday and Friday, that might be a great place to catch up with these things. I hope I can deliver on that. While members were disappointed, our article continues, that they couldn't get the amendment adopted during the markup, there are benefits to a floor vote. Crap, I could have just read this instead of explaining it to you. It will put every member on the record about the president needing to come to Congress for a new authorization if he wants to strike Iran. Whew. Thankfully, they gave us a very helpful and illustrative, similar but different point. The thing that was important and should not be missed in that debate was that Republicans wanted a restriction of the use of force. Republicans wanted it, noted Garamendi, who's been one of the Democrats most forcefully pushing to repeal the 2001 AUMF for years, along with Lee and McGovern. Garamendi even said he was willing to shut down the government over the fight to repeal the 2001 AUMF. But really, are they? There are also drawbacks to such an amendment. Let's read what they have to say about those. Democrats who spoke on the condition of anonymity. I should have been anonymous in all this. Shoot. All right, this is all off the record. Everyone forget what I said. You didn't hear it from me. I don't know who else you could convince anybody you heard this from, but try. Democrats who spoke on condition of anonymity expressed concern that leadership would use the language, specifically blocking war with Iran, to justify Democrats caving on the 2001 authority repeal. Now that that's snuck through in an appropriations bill, we have to think about, okay, so if we're, that's an interesting thought, right? If that thing is doomed at some point anyway, should we start planning our exit on it? If we cave on that, we can at least point to the limitation language that's in the NDAA forbidding, technically, the use of kinetic action in Iran. And if there is some Republican support for that, maybe that would survive. Maybe that would stand up. Maybe that would justify some outrage on the part of Republicans, who are, I guess, typically people that would need to move on, building, say, support for impeachment. If there were Republicans in Congress who said, we are placing a very intentional limitation on the president's war-making authority here, the most important thing, arguably, that they've got, and the president says, to hell with you, I don't care what the law says, I'm having a war anyway, and Republicans are angry about that, then maybe you get somewhere on impeachment, but maybe not. All right. So drawbacks to the amendment include that it might be used by Democratic leadership to justify caving on outright repeal. Essentially, the House could pass the NDAA with a provision prohibiting the use of the 2001 AUMF to go to war with Iran, and then Speaker Nancy Pelosi could make the case that Democrats had already restrained the Trump administration's biggest target for war, and therefore could agree to pass the final spending deal, the Appropriations Bill, with the Senate, even if it didn't include the AUMF repeal. All right, now we're getting somewhere. Using the 2001 AUMF to justify war with Iran is a legally tenuous case, but as you know, Trump wouldn't care about that. But it's one for which the Trump administration has already been laying the groundwork. That's how you know they don't care. If Democrats could effectively block the possibility of an unauthorized war with Iran, that would be a significant win. It would not, however, preclude Trump's ability to wage dozens of other military actions, nor, I would remind you, even that one, or stop him from a first strike under the War Powers Resolution if he deemed it a national emergency, and he would never do that, right? A term he's already shown a willingness to define loosely. Democrats may be willing to gamble that by taking away the administration's top target for war, they could theoretically run out the clock on his presidency without additional military conflict. But it's a question each member has to ask themselves. You have so well described the great Washington parlor game, one Democratic member said after we laid out this theory. This is what everybody loves to do, and that is to hypothesize over all of the players. I guess we do love that, even here. This member thought the theory was wrong, that Pelosi was genuinely aiming to repeal the 2001 AUMF, and that Democrats would fight for it even if it meant risking a shutdown. But either way, there is something holding up this repeal. Next section is bipartisan obstacles. McConnell is always a barrier for Democrats. Senator Tim Kaine and other Senate Democrats have tried for years to repeal the 2001 War Authority, and they've run up against McConnell every time. The Kentucky Republicans signaled earlier this year that far from restricting the president's ability to go to war with Iran, he's concerned America is not doing enough to curb the Islamic Republic. One of the few rebukes McConnell has issued Trump was when the president abruptly pulled out of Syria at the end of last year. McConnell introduced a resolution urging caution and citing America's interest in countering Iran. Trump himself doesn't seem very warm to the idea of restricting his war abilities. He rattled his own saber on Twitter in May when he wrote, "If Iran wants to fight, that will be the official end of Iran. Never threaten the United States again." And his allies in Congress, like Senator Tom Cotton, have shown an outright eagerness to take on the country. Unprovoked attacks on commercial shipping warrant a retaliatory military strike, Cotton said on Face the Nation last weekend after explosions damaged 2 oil tankers in the Gulf of Oman. The president has the authorization to act to defend American interests. Some Democratic members are concerned that the Trump administration is either deliberately pushing the country into a war with Iran, similar to what happened with Iraq, or that the president and his team are so mismanaging and escalating the situation that they will stumble into a conflict they can't control. Moulton, who is running for president, believe it or not, and is one of the only members of Congress who has been in combat, said some of the characters involved are the same as with Iraq, John Bolton and the draft-dodging president and Cheney family. Dick Cheney was pushing us towards war with Iraq, Moulton said. Liz Cheney in the House is pushing us towards war. You obviously know that she's his daughter, but they reiterate that for those who might not. Moulton saw similarities not only with Iraq, but also with an earlier war, saying that the Trump administration looked as if it wanted to justify action with a Gulf of Tonkin-type incident, referring to the hyped-up incident between a U.S. destroyer and some North Vietnamese boats that led to the Vietnam War. Freshman Representative Abigail Spanberger, who is by law to be included in every single story there is. It's amazing she's not more famous. Who was once a CIA officer, mentioned how lawmakers should have learned the lesson of faulty intelligence by now. Part of the lesson from Iraq is that when you go looking for a specific answer, you will find it, Spanberger said. The nature of intelligence is that you will sometimes have conflicting reports. But it's more than Republicans are advocating for war, or at least not wanting to rein in their president. Congress has failed for years to repeal this authority, even though Democrats had unified control of the House, Senate, and White House from 2009 to 2011, repealing the 2001 AUMF was not a priority. Even later into Obama's presidency, after his administration had repeatedly used the 2001 AUMF to justify new military engagements, he was only willing to repeal a 2002 AUMF specifically for Iraq. He wanted to leave his options open on the broader 2001 authority. If you give a president the power, Lee said, whether it's a Democrat or a Republican, if Congress has abdicated our responsibility to the executive, they'll use it, which is also a good lesson if Congress abdicates their responsibility to rein in or remove an out-of-control executive. They'll use that leverage too. Things will get worse. But that's another story. When HuffPost repeatedly pressed Lee as to why Democrats hadn't already repealed the 2001 AUMF in their first 6 months of power, Lee kept saying we'd have to ask other members. Maybe it has something to do with the Senate. But okay. I guess there's some resistance somewhere. We don't know where, but I think that sooner or later this is going to break through, she said. Khanna also indicated that he thought Democrats were less unified on repealing the AUMF than many other members let on. There's still work to be done to convince folks that we need a foreign policy of restraint and that interventionism of the last 20 years has made us less safe and has been a blunder in many places, he said, though he did say a more restrained foreign policy was gaining ground among both parties. Whether it's become the prevailing majority, that remains to be seen, he said. Either way, Democrats have the ability to at least show voters they're serious about repealing this authority. The appropriations package that included the AUMF repeal passed Wednesday, that would be yesterday, 226 to 203, with every Republican opposed to the bill. In the House, at least, Republicans can't stop Democrats from demonstrating their values on war, and Republicans acknowledge that. Representative Peter King, a Republican of New York, perhaps the most hawkish member of Congress, you think? So hawkish that he doesn't believe the president even needs an AUMF for military action, and neither does the president, I'm sure, told HuffPost that the democratic process plays a part, just a part, in decisions about war. Elections have consequences, King said. We lost the election, is the reality. Well, that's true. That doesn't tell us very much about what happened here or why he's voting how he's voting or why he believes what he believes. If elections have consequences, then why wouldn't it matter if the president had authorization for the use of military force or not? I guess they only matter for certain things. Okay, well, that turned into a very interesting examination of the rules, procedure, the parlor game, and the Iran war. So maybe we really did do something of a lightning round after all wrapped up in this one neat package. There's an awful lot more happening, of course, things we're going to have to examine. Maybe tomorrow would be a good day. We should see if Armando is free, because it looks like the Supreme Court is going to end up dropping all the rest of their cases for this session, I guess today or tomorrow, and included among them will be a decision on the census citizenship question, which has, of course, the circumstances around the question have changed dramatically out here in the court of public opinion. We'll have to see how much weight the court is willing to give them. And I guess a lot of people are saying that this will give us some maybe final indication about whether or not John Roberts has any intention to stick with his commitment to saving the legacy, whether it's true or not, of the Supreme Court for the immediate future or perhaps for all time. Wow. So lots to investigate there. Hearings continue of sorts in the House, people getting irritated with the pace of oversight, not only court cases not proceeding from contempt standpoint, but also Hope Hicks. How does she do it? She does it in secret, apparently. She showed up for she doesn't do it at all, actually. And then she does the nothing in secret as well. She showed up for her testimony. They decided to go close doors on her. And then even after doing that, apparently a Department of Justice lawyer showed up to object to every question that she was asked and to claim that executive privilege prevented her from discussing anything about her time in the White House. And apparently that is being followed up by another closed-door appearance, which has got more people up in arms. This time, Felix Sater, set to testify apparently tomorrow before the House Intelligence Committee, also behind closed doors, and that has people upset too, because why bother? Maybe he has some other information to reveal that we don't know about yet, but for the most part, the things that he's done are supposed to be a matter of public record already. But you never know, maybe he has some bombshells later on, but that doesn't make anybody particularly happy. if you were hoping that holding a series of investigative hearings in front of the American people would help bolster the case for impeachment, and all the hearings are unaired. I guess that would kind of create a problem. Lots more to catch up on, of course. Lots more that we could be discussing. Maybe the thing to do at this point, besides teasing you with the many other things that we'll discuss maybe and other shows in the near future, is to tell you what Justice Putnam has got on tap for you. And it's too late to change his mind on today's show, on today's West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy. Well, here we go. Trump is, quote, just wholesale detaining mothers, fathers, and children. It's out of control, is the quote, and it almost sounds like there might be concentration camps going on out there. Trump's campaign manager pretends not to believe in polls as he spends big on polling. McConnell and his henchmen grant the lifetime judgeship to a raging bigot. Oh, it's a day that ends in Y, and much more, some of which I can sneak in
From
after
Daily
this.
Co's Radio on netrootsradio.com. You have been listening to the Kagro in the Morning Show
with David Waldman.
All right, ready for the rest of the stuff. Christian nationalist Senator Josh Hawley of Missouri proposed a new bill that would force Facebook to publish Nazis, even if Facebook wants to publish Nazis willingly. Well, why not double up on the authority? And of course, much more, this time from around the world in the second half of West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy next. Why don't I just keep talking? One of these days I should just keep going for hours and hours.